flow will be, I will sort of tee us up, I'll introduce Fiona, we'll ask her some questions, and then we'll sort of let it go to areas that we're interested in. I know folks in the community, particularly in our Substackers crew, had some questions that they were already really excited to ask you, Fiona. So we'll dive in with that. But one RenCo tradition is actually to do like a surprise intro. And so I actually am going to have Lexi introduce you to the group.
Wow.
How lucky am I? So Fiona is one of my dearest friends, and I feel so lucky to introduce you because you're beyond wonderful. And you know, when you walk into the room and you can just tell that someone's full of magic, that's Fiona. I think that Fiona and I actually were talking this week, and we were kind of talking about like how you find the things that you want to do in the world. And Fiona, I hope it's okay I mentioned this, but you brought up this brilliant point about sometimes you know the space, or you know specifically what questions you really want to focus on and think about answering. And like one of the things that you said that I loved was just like, for you, that question was like, how can we be creative in the world and also make money? Like, how can you be really creative and also earn a living? And like, how does that work? And I can only imagine that that's what Fiona gets to think about in her job as like the head of writer partnerships at Substack all the time. And I thought it'd be really cool to briefly introduce Fiona based off a few of her qualities that I really personally admire and would love to learn from her. So it's like, what are the things that Fiona exemplifies so well where I'm like, I want to be more like that? And the first was like an innate curiosity for the world. Fiona, you have this just unbelievable curiosity for people, for their stories, for where they come from, for why they're here, for how they interact, that I just admire so much. And every time around you, I just love learning from you. And I think it's like, just like understanding how people respond and kind of and think through every interaction and like why they're here, I can imagine is a really big part of your role at Substack on a day-to-day basis. The second is courage. Fiona is one of the most courageous people I know. Fiona was very successful at Facebook and was like leading a team and on Instagram as it was blowing up and doing an amazing job, and realized, I think deep down inside, that there were other things she was really interested in. And that like there are other stories and other things for her to share in the world. And I'm just so impressed that it's so, as someone else who's left a big company, it takes so much courage to make that leap. And I remember talking to you about Substack and you were so excited and you just knew. So your courage is something that I admire and I always want to learn from. And the third is leadership. So Fiona is an amazing leader. She's incredible at making decisions with incomplete information, which we all know is super critical when you're working in a startup or a big company. But even more importantly, I can just imagine if you were interviewing to be on Fiona's team, it's like fall over. Oh my gosh, I am so lucky to get to work with her. She is so focused on empowering other people and making sure that they can shine as brightly as they possibly can. And that's one of the many things that I love about you. So without further ado, we are honored and lucky to have Nadia and Fiona.
Oh my God, that was the nicest thing that's ever happened to me. Thank you, Lexi. That was so thoughtful.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Lex. That was an awesome intro. So everyone, we're so excited to have Fiona tonight. She is the head of writer partnerships at Substack, as well as their first hire. And as Lexi mentioned, before joining Substack as its first employee, she led the comms team at Instagram that was focused on global programs, had a tremendous amount of impact there. And prior to that, she was the director of marketing and comms at Pop-Up Magazine Productions. And she's been in the book publishing world. She led PR for James Patterson, who's the world's best-selling author. She just is so incredibly amazing and has had so much impact throughout her career already. So super excited to have you. So Fiona, I think just to get us started, I know we had talked about a couple of themes that we thought would be super relevant to RenCo. I think the first is sort of around your career and journey at Substack and how, as the first employee, you sort of found your way there and what sort of excited you about the vision, what that growth has been like. And the second is really about the writer experience at Substack and how we have so many writers in our community who would be really excited to sort of hear your insider perspective there. Do you have one of those two topics you'd be more excited to start with?
Oh, I'm down to talk about both, either in any order, whatever would be sort of helpful or interesting for folks. Yeah, whatever you want to dive into.
Awesome. So I think maybe let's start a little bit with like your journey at Substack. And I think one question that the community has had, I think Ali raised this, is just it's pretty amazing that you were the first employee there. And obviously, you know, there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes before all of us today sort of know the name of Substack and are talking about it like, you know, everyone has known what it is forever. And so we're very curious, like tell us a little bit about your journey and what it was sort of like on your end. You know, you were probably working quite hard for a while as it sort of gained traction, and just tell us about your experience there.
Yeah, totally. Let's see. So I've been at Substack now. It's a little over a year and a couple months. And what's really surreal about the experience is that it feels like a lot of people know what Substack is now. And that was not the case when I joined, to the point when, you know, I was telling colleagues at Instagram that I was leaving and I was going to work at something called Substack. And most everyone, 95% of people were like, what's that? What do you mean you're leaving? And where newsletters? Oh, I like newsletters, but had never heard of it and really kind of couldn't comprehend what I was talking about, that I would go work for like a newsletter service essentially. And to fast forward to now, it feels like, you know, when I'm talking to writers, when I'm talking to a lot of people day to day, I'm actually not doing the part of the thing where I'm describing what Substack is. I'm getting right into like, how do we think about editorial plans? How do you think about launching? And that's been really surreal. And there has been a whole bunch of stuff going on behind the scenes. As sort of in the beginning, when it was just me and the three founders, there were just a lot of decisions we were making about how to even set up the team. Like, of course, we needed to hire engineers, but we also needed to hire people to work with writers and figure out, well, how will people work with writers? What does that actually look like? How do we, you know, we had some visions about there should be people that kind of can go out and talk to writers and be the sort of like recruiting arm or like the outreach arm. And then that there should be people inside the company that can help writers be successful with the model. And we knew that sort of innately, but how to actually build the teams around it was something that we thought a lot about in those early days. And now Substack is a team of 20. So we're still really small, but bigger and growing.
And Fiona, related to that, you know, a question that Ali had was just around like, you know, as you sort of were working on this, like, was there a tipping point where you sort of realized that like Substack was gaining traction, or did you know ahead of time, like, all right, we think it's going to blow up in this way, or what was that sort of experience like on the inside?
That's a good question. I think it was sort of this, it's been sort of this like slow realization of like awakening to people just talking about Substack. And I think that, I mean, one thing that's certainly been true is that the pandemic has sort of accelerated things for Substack, in part because of the way that it's impacted, the pandemic has so viscerally impacted the way that journalists do their work and the way that sort of ad-supported online media is really hurting right now. And so certainly probably like March or April was when I felt, just like from a like work standpoint, the volume of things going on in my inbox was really intense, because so many journalists who had been laid off, who didn't know what to do, were turning to Substack as an alternative model. Maybe it was because this could be an in-between before they start their next job. Maybe it was that they always wanted to kind of go independent and have this publication, and now is the time. Or maybe it was simply like, I don't know exactly what I'm going to do next, but in the meantime, I'll just have a mailing list to collect people so that when I figure it out, I can export this mailing list and do something else. So that to me, I feel like was sort of this like really intense time for the world, for journalists, and for Substack. But I don't know, I think one sort of like anecdote that comes to mind in thinking about like to me, it's just like a conversation that I had a year and a half ago, basically, with a literary agent. I was talking to a literary agent about having one of their authors come onto Substack and write. And in describing Substack, she had absolutely no idea what I was talking about a year and a half ago. She went to our website. She was like, there's a list. I don't understand this list. Why would you be telling me to, have my writer start a mailing list and start a newsletter? They already have a mailing list. They have a newsletter. This absolutely couldn't comprehend what I was pitching or why. And fast forward to, now maybe it's a few months ago, having a conversation with that literary agent calling me to say, I think I have a bunch of writers who would be a really good fit for Substack. And can we talk about strategies? And that to me is just like, wow, a lot has changed in this period of time.
That's incredible. And Fiona, so I mean, what an amazing, sort of turning point in that relationship. But I'm curious, tell me a little bit about Substack's vision and what it means to you, because I think you are in such a unique position where you both get to experience it inside the company, but you also are on the front lines of engaging with folks this woman. And how have you seen that evolve? How have you articulated that? Tell us a little bit about how does that vision relate to you and your work?
Yeah. For the vision question, I guess how I think about it is basically a world in which there are more and more writers who can write about sort of the topics that they're most interested in, the topics that they're experts in, and can have really, really high quality writing in the world, and readers can subscribe and pay to those writers directly. I want to live in a world where there is so much of that, because I think the impact on culture and the way that it will impact what we read and what we think and how we talk is going to be a really, really beautiful future if there's as much of that as possible. And so I think about sort of the reader equation in this question of how it's going to be for a reader to kind of be able to experience and pick and kind of have a whole variety of things, particularly things that might not have been possible through mainstream media, like all of the niche, super subculture groups and topics and areas can suddenly be supported through a reader-funded sort of network where readers pay writers. So that relationship is sort of the core thing about Substack, the reader to the writer. And I think that's the vision, was that from the beginning, and that's going to kind of carry through no matter what we do.
That makes a ton of sense. And I think it's so interesting hearing about that reader-writer relationship. I think community is something that we both experience at RenCo, but also talk about a ton in some of our other operator you should know chats. And I'm curious, are there sort of things that surprised you or were unique that you discovered around that writer relationship with their readers?
Yeah, I think the thing about community that's really interesting for Substack, so I'm going to talk about two different things. It's the reader community and then it's the writer community. And I think about those two things all the time and differentiate them. So with the reader community, there's a way for writers who are publishing on Substack to have a community of readers around their work. And I work a lot with writers on what does that look like? How do you actually create a habit of reading among your writers? How do you create a community here? And what are some of the tools that you have in the toolbox on Substack to do so? And then there's a community of writers, the sort of larger network of writers reaching out to each other, supporting each other, and how do we learn from writers doing things on Substack, and when possible, connect the dots. And yeah, I could dig into either of those or both of those, whatever is more interesting. But I think about those two areas when I think about community. That's sort of where my head goes.
I think the writer community is something that I think is very near and dear, because we do have a lot of writers in Renaissance Collective. And so I would love, if you could, to just expand a little bit on that writer community in particular. And I think some of the things that have come up sort of internally, we discussed it on Slack, is just around, where are the writers coming from? Are they individuals? Are they coming sort of from, bigger media companies? What does it look like? And this is getting a little bit into our second theme, but what does it look like to be successful as a writer on Substack? And how do you sort of think about that?
Yeah. So first part, where are writers coming from? I'm seeing it sort of it's really varied, in the sense that there are writers who I think are maybe being laid off or maybe dissatisfied by sort of an institution, a legacy media outlet that they work for, and wanting to kind of shift gears, wanting to kind of have that independence, wanting to have the reader relationship, and sort of have that direct relationship with their readers and audience. And that's one of the sort of reasons that people are coming to Substack. But another, I think, is there's a lot of sort of freelance writers on Substack, so that they have bylines in lots of other outlets. They're doing other things to sort of make money from writing, and that Substack is one of those ways. And then there's quite a lot of people who have a full-time job, have totally different things going on in their life. They're not actually like self-described writers, but they're turning to Substack as something that they want to do as a hobby on the side. Maybe it's a side hustle. Maybe it's just a way that they want to kind of build a community. Maybe it's actually that they want to release audio on a week-to-week basis and do less of the writing. So it's really varied. So I couldn't really pinpoint exactly where writers are coming from at this moment, because it feels fairly balanced across all of those things. But in terms of the question of what makes a writer successful, that's another sort of nuanced question, but I'll talk through it a little bit. In part, it's nuanced because what success looks like is so different for everyone. So a writer who is focused on this being a side hustle, they want to make sort of meaningful side income. It's not a full-time job. Maybe they have another form of employment. The revenue number that they might have, or the sort of goal for themselves of like how often they want to publish is one thing. And that's really different than a person who's sort of trying to go independent and do this full time. And so the conversations that I have with writers are dependent on sort of those goals. And one thing that I'd say though, that I find is true of the top writers on Substack, it's true of like writers who are self-described as like finding success on Substack. One thing that the common ground is a consistency in the publishing schedule. So I tend to find that writers who are publishing at least once a week, what they're doing in that with that cadence is setting up a relationship with their readers that is about that habit. So their readers come to expect that, let's say it's Mondays, the newsletter lands on Mondays, and that is the sort of like, that is the habit that they want to form, and that the writer sort of understands what's different about this model is that their intimacy of the email space, that there are readers subscribed to them, looking probably to have sort of access or connection or this relationship to the writer. And the quicker that writers can realize the way that the model is different in that capacity, I think usually success, like they can get into this mode of like, okay, I can be successful with this. So publishing once a week at minimum, I would say is like one of the things that a lot of the top writers have in common. Often it's more than once a week, 2 or even 3 times, but that it's not all writing actually that's happening. I would say it's a fair amount of writing, community, and then maybe like something else. Maybe it's something long form, maybe it's a short take, some kind of like varied to make sure that they are getting in front of readers and kind of having this relationship to them. That tends to be some common ground I see. Consistency is so hard. It is so hard. I know. Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, Fiona, there's like so many insights there. I want to open it up because I could ask you questions the whole hour, but we have so many great questions in chat from community members. And so I think on the theme of writing, Ali, I think you had a couple of great questions. So if you're comfortable unmuting and asking those, and I'll sort of popcorn around by theme for the questions. Not quite in order, but I'll make sure to cover them all, folks. But Ali, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, hi. I'm so glad that we're talking about this, Fiona. I'm really glad to meet you, and I'm stoked. I'm a freelance writer, so this is super relevant to me. I have some big picture questions, and if they're too big, just ask me to make them more concrete.
I love it. Let's do it.
But I guess the thing I'm wondering about is like, to what extent do you see Substack as part of this bigger change in the way that people consume news and writing in general? And if so, like, what do you see as the benefits of that? And like, what are the trade-offs? Like, what would you worry about if this like becomes like a much more dominant way that people get their news even than it is now, which I mean, I'm sure I would be curious if you have like data on that. But yeah.
Yeah. From a like, yeah, how do people get their news? How does this sort of like impact the sort of like larger story about where the media industry is going? It's a really interesting question. And I guess the way that I'm really optimistic about it and bullish on it, and think that it, like, Substack can present a really interesting alternative to sort of like what's available today. I'm excited about the idea that writers are at the helm of their destiny, basically, like that they get to be in control. So on Substack, you know, you guys probably all know this, but just like quick context, you own everything that you do on Substack. So that's the writing, of course, it's your mailing list, it's your payment relationships, it's everything, and you can leave at any time. And so because of that because of the ownership involved, because you're making 90% of your subscription revenue, to me, that creates this sort of like the ownership and independence in this equation is so compelling to me as a business model that hasn't exactly been possible to creative people, to writers in the past. And so a world where sort of writers can have that direct relationship with their readers and create whatever sort of thing it is they're creating, if it's investigative journalism and that's the thing that a community can form around it, I think that's like an excellent way to read and to consume media. And I think that putting writers at the helm of it, instead of sort of being reliant on ad-supported media, on clicks and engagement, to me, that creates much more opportunity for really, really compelling journalism to be created. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question in full, but those are some thoughts.
I think Mishti is another amazing writer in our community, and she also had a great question. Mishti, do you want to jump in?
Sure, yes, called out as asking a very personal question, but I was curious about writers who, I mean, it's natural to start with family and friends and plus one, and at some point you kind of run out of those people. And writers who are just breaking out of that kind of close circle. I'm curious what you've observed about things that they're doing that work particularly well, especially things that might be surprising or underrated or people don't really realize. Because just like on Substack, when I'm kind of at this point, and when I see like random emails pop up in my subscription thing, I'm always like, I have no idea where they came from. Like, I'm not really sure how to extend beyond that close-knit circle. So I'd love to hear about that.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. And so I would love to basically like dig in with you, like, and learn everything about your publication and like do a strategy session, but I won't do it now in front of everyone. And instead I'll say some tactical things that I think about generally that might be helpful. So when a writer is just starting out, particularly a writer who doesn't necessarily have like an audience that is like a big presence and a mailing list already formed, and they're coming to Substack and talking to those people. So instead, sort of building from scratch. So the friends and family is, of course, like step one, like tell your friends and family, email them, like make sure that they know. And then it's also having on your publication or your newsletter everywhere that's possible. So your about page, your thank you for subscribing email, your unfinished subscription email, all of these places are sort of basically static pages that are also, like, I think of them as marketing opportunities, even just to articulate what it is that you're doing with the publication, why it matters to you, what does a subscription afford? If you have subscriptions turned on, and you may not, it might be free, which is also great. But if you have subscriptions turned on, one thing that I think matters, particularly as more people start newsletters, is to articulate why do you have subscriptions? Like, is it the creative freedom? Is it the editorial control? Is it that you want to kind of build this out into a publication that would one day have editors and guest writers? Is it that it actually creates the peace of mind for you to focus on this? Is it that you want to have a community around your work? Whatever it may be, spending some time articulating that and creating it, sort of like making it visible on the static pages that exist within Substack helps quite a lot, plus putting in subscribe buttons. But I've seen that kind of help drive subscriptions, in part because one thing that I think some people are doing is turning to their friends and family, or turning to sort of a larger network, their social media channels, let's say, and just saying, hey, I've started a newsletter, click here. And I don't think that strategy actually works quite well. We all get too many emails. We all don't actually know if we want to subscribe to these other emails. But what we do potentially know is that we want to support great writing. We want to support the creative at the end of it. And we, if it speaks to whatever niche you're writing about, whatever topic you're writing about, to articulate why you're focused on that, people will find it. So that's one thing. The other, that this is like probably too obvious, but I've found it really helpful, is to ask friends and family to like use the share button really early on in Substack. So on Substack context, like there's a share button, there's a subscribe button, there's a couple of things that that are just sort of built in, but some people delete them, some people don't know about them, some people don't throw them into their posts. And in the early days, I think it's really important to kind of focus on telling your friends and family, if possible. I was working with a writer today who, her line in her newsletter is, the best compliment you could give me is to share this newsletter with other friends you think would be interested, and then like drop in the share button. So that's really tactical advice, but I've seen that work quite well.
That's awesome, Fiona. So I'm seeing another theme sort of emerging in our questions in the chat around sort of Substack in the industry and their sort of positioning and technology, as well as your own experiences at Substack and Instagram. So I want to take it back to Daniel, who had a question earlier. Daniel, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for taking the time. And I have my own newsletter, as much as probably a lot of people on the call do here too. So I really appreciate you taking the time. One thing actually was interesting that we had brought up is kind of Substack's role in the media landscape. And I noticed that you had some experience earlier. Sorry, Nadia, this is a little bit tangential to the question that I had originally, but I'm actually curious to hear from you, Fiona. It seems like you had some experience in magazines. And so personally, like some friends and I were kind of wondering, it seems like millennials are not getting like hard copy magazines, or there needs to be some sort of blend between soft and hard copy media. And I'm curious, like, we're kind of joking around the idea of maybe launching like a really well-designed, small, almost coffee table-esque quarterly magazine. Is that a bad idea? Like, are magazines just like totally dead, or like, in the realm of like, media consumption today, is that just like a horrible idea, or what's kind of your original impression on that?
Oh, let's see. I think it's really cool that you're thinking about doing that. And I guess I would probably ask you back what your goals are with it. Because to me, what's really special about print is the ability to kind of have this thing that can sit on a coffee table, that you can bring to a party, that you can show people. And as somebody who worked in book publishing and magazine publishing, I love that. I care about that deeply. But I would probably also, so that's one thing, sort of like the artifact of it, the beautiful thing. If it's like if you're writing about the design piece, like is there photography? Like it would sort of be dependent maybe on what it is you're trying to achieve and why you want to have the hard copy version of it. And I think that in many cases it's a great thing to have. What I would probably want to know more about is what you're writing about and who your readers would be, and sort of like think about that with you. And one thing that might be interesting that I think a lot about is sort of like the complementary world that, that there's something that could live in like a subscription form on Substack, in part so that you can kind of get paid directly, in part so that it can be a sustainable business over time, but that it complements what you're doing potentially in print form. So I work with lots of writers, for instance, who have a book and have our Substack, and that's like that's it. That's what they do. They're like published authors, and then they sort of have their subscription business on Substack. And I think those two things can work really nicely. But it's so dependent, right, on like what you're writing about, or who you are, what your audience is. Are you starting out for the first time writing, or are you a sort of established author who's published many times?
Yeah, all that definitely makes sense. I mean, especially dialing in what the audience is, and it's just been interesting to observe millennial behavior not being one to. I mean, I can't name any of my friends that have subscriptions to physical magazines, but it's Substack, of course, is kind of twisted or taken a different lens on how media can be consumed, because historically it was like impossible to get somebody to pay for something, right? So it's impressive to see.
Yeah, and that would be like, that's another question about like the print version would be like, how are you thinking about making money from it? If that even is it, like, is it sort of like an investment? Do you want to make money on it first of all, or is this like sort of a piece of art that you don't intend to? But if it is something like that, you want to have it be a business venture that that can support more of your work, then it's like, well, one thing, this is just an idea that I'm not necessarily suggesting, but I've seen people do it on Substack, which is from the subscription revenue that they generate from their publication, then taking that to create other sort of artistic forms. So I work with an artist that I was talking to today, actually, who she has her Substack and it's full-time income. But on the side, she sort of like creates these prints. And then for some of her readers, her paid subscribers, she sends the prints out. So there's sort of ways that maybe they can work in tandem.
Awesome. Yeah, that's incredible advice. Thank you so much.
Sure. There's a lot of action in the chat around people who currently still subscribe to physical magazines and love it, and folks who have tried it and sort of given it up. But I think you'll have a lot of interesting zine subscribers in RenCo for sure. I wanted to turn over to Valentine, actually, because I saw a bunch of plus ups to your question, and I think you had a great one. Do you want to jump in?
Sure thing. So the question that I have is, as we move to a world where newsletters will become more and more prominent, and I'm reminded actually of an interview I was listening to yesterday with Casey Newton on his transition to writing on Substack. He talked about the formation of sort of Scooby gangs of writers getting together and kind of having their own community newsletter within a Substack. And if that means of distributing information becomes more and more common, you can sort of have these groups of newsletters replacing traditional media outlets. And the question that I have related to that is, as this becomes more common, what kind of safeguards should platforms like Substack have in place to prevent the spread of misinformation?
Yeah, not an easy question, but an important one. So for quick context I didn't listen to the interview, but one of the things that you're getting at with Casey that he must be thinking about himself is basically, and there's like a whole bunch of ways we can take this conversation too, but basically, what does it look like when writers are teaming up together? Maybe it's to create a media publication, maybe it's to create sort of like a bundling opportunity, maybe it's to create actually a sort of a new style of media company. And some, like Casey himself, is sort of like becoming almost like his own like media operator. And potentially over time, I don't know if he's thinking about it, but some writers in that are sort of like hiring other people to like sort of work on this thing. And how do we sort of have the safeguards in place to like make sure that what's being published is accurate and that sort of like it's a good reading experience. So how I think about this is like we have content guidelines and that get into the fact that sort of we don't allow like the most horrific of things, like there are rules. And beyond that though, like what we do believe is that we believe in a free press and we believe about extending that to as many writers as possible. And I think that it's a really hard question that obviously so many platforms, so many publishers are dealing with right now, and will be, increasingly important for Substack. And we will probably have a lot more to say about it publicly because it's one of the most important conversations that's kind of happening right now, I think, across the media and sort of in platforms too.
I think bundling in this theme, and I mean, there's so many important points in there, but bundling is something that I think is like a theme that came out of this, as well as a couple of the comments in the chat. And so DK, I think you had a question there, and I would love for you to ask it.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. And thanks for joining us, Fiona.
Yeah.
I had asked a question in the chat, and I think it dovetails a bit on what we were just addressing with like groups of writers.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think about, some of the beauty of Substack is that it's really an empowering tool and a utility to help writers kind of own and control their destiny. And at the same time, as a consumer, I sometimes don't want to build lots and lots of individual relationships, and I'd rather sort of purchase in the form of a bundle. And, I think when I would want to purchase like that, it may be that it kind of pushes us a little bit, one step closer to the older models. And I wonder sort of, how do you think about finding the balance there? Is that something that the platform should sort of inject or imbue any taste or kind of act as a publisher, or should the platform kind of be more kind of acting as a distributor of information? And I just wonder, sort of, is that still sort of being explored, or do you have a strong view on how that should play out?
Yeah, I think we have a lot to figure out on this, but we do have a strong view on it, which is that, you know, writers should decide who, if bundle economics can make a lot of sense. And I think that writers should be the ones to decide who they would be bundled with. So writers that kind of want to team up together and they decide they want to be sort of like a collective and bundle their work together and have one subscription price set. We want to live in a world where we can make that possible for writers. And we don't want to be in the position where we decide what gets bundled and we're the ones sort of like making the decisions on sort of who's, you know, these are all the art publications, so everyone should pay this price. We're not going to go down that route. So that's how I think about it. The bundling is really interesting. We have a lot to figure out, and we want writers to be empowered and in charge of what makes sense to them.
So then, do you operate primarily as a distributor and not as a publisher?
Yeah, we're definitely not a publisher. Very much
more like the newsstand, and not sort of imbuing any of your own taste or preference on
exactly
the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Cool. Interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. I like the newsstand sort of metaphor there, DK. Christian, I know you have a question you're really excited to ask. Do you want to jump in?
Very excited about it. Thank you, Fiona, for coming. So I have a specific question. I've heard for a long time a narrative about newsrooms and bureaus that kind of a lot of older subject matter experts over the past 2 decades have been let go, and that newsrooms have gotten younger and maybe less experience and subject matter expertise on specific subjects like, you know, Middle Eastern politics or something like that. And that a lot of journalism that's coming out about these more, you know, complex subjects that these older journalists would write about, you know, has just suffered as a result of that. What I'm curious about is, this is kind of a broader intro into like when you're going out and you're trying to find writers that you think might fill a particular niche within Substack, like I've just heard this narrative over and over again. And I kind of wonder, like, you're going after these people who might be 40 or 50 years old, who might not gravitate towards a technology platform like Substack, which feels kind of like a younger thing. I mean, do you have kind of outreach efforts for like groups of people, or do you think that these subject matter experts might be able to transition and land on Substack, or how would you go about trying to get them to do something that's so kind of like maybe out of their wheelhouse?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think about it from the writer standpoint of like writers that might make the transition to be on Substack from like, yeah, maybe that age demographic, but also their readership might be on the older side too. So like wanting to make sure that Substack is sort of as easy to use from a writer standpoint, but is also like accessible and makes sense to a reader who's experiencing it. And to answer your question of, do we have like outreach efforts particularly focused on that? Not really, like in the sense that we are so small that it's kind of just me like and my 2 colleagues, and the 3 of us we spend all our time trying to figure out, like, talk to interesting writers all day long of all like shapes and sizes and topics and areas, and talk about what it would look like to bring them to Substack, to bring their work to Substack. So so to answer the question of, is there like an outreach group particularly focused on that? No, but are we working with writers, and have I talked to writers, and are there writers on Substack who kind of sound similar to what you're describing? Absolutely. There's one in particular, and I'm just going to share this anecdote because it's from today. There's this writer, her name's Diana Butler Bass. She writes about faith and religion, and she's in her 60s, and she's a terrific writer, brilliant writer. She was one of the people who was in the last fellowship batch, and that Substack did. And she has shared a lot about sort of like her readership being in like mostly in their 60s, and she herself is in her 60s, and like is this going to work? Is this going to translate? And through her, she's kind of talked about that, like this is working really, really well for her standpoint. It's the first time in her life that she's had sort of readers subscribing to her work. She's written for 1 million publications. She's sort of like had 1 million different jobs. She was at the Washington Post for a long time. But this is the first time where she feels like in control. That she can have that direct relationship, she can set the price, and she can kind of have readers reach out to her and ask her questions that wouldn't have been possible in some of the other outlets. So I think this is one anecdote, but I was talking to her about it today, and it sounds like it's working quite well for her and her readers. And I hope to see more of it. I think it can work for like pretty much anyone really.
Yeah, I wonder like if somebody doesn't have an audience. Yeah, I mean, there's certain people that might have writing talent, but they may have stopped writing and they don't have an active audience right now.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like they would face an uphill battle, but that's like anybody who's trying to build a following, it would be tough. I guess I just care about this particular thing because it seems like a lot of criticism of journalism has been along these lines, and I have really high hopes for Substack because I just think it aligns much better with like society and creating a better kind of feedback loop, I guess, for people to write about better things and not just try to grab eyeballs.
Yeah. And to your point about, about it being hard for somebody who doesn't have an audience, I think that's absolutely true. Like it is hard. It's hard to do anything, right? It's hard to build a company from scratch. It's hard to build a small business from scratch. It's hard to be an actress moving to Hollywood and start from scratch. It's hard. But is it possible? And are there sort of like some strategies and ways and like communities that can form around helping? Yes. And is it possible to kind of like make Substack work for like fit into the writing rhythm in your life and sort of your goals? I hope so, and I believe so, and I hope to see more of it.
I think very much on this theme, but sort of thinking about a different group. I think DK had a question around like, how do you think about local news and writing in sort of green shoots of promising new ways that paid newsletters are sort of working for reinventing local news, Fiona?
Oh my gosh, I want to see so much more local news on Substack. I care so much about it, and I'm really excited about the opportunities with it. I think, there's some really, really promising local news reporters and teams of reporters that I've seen on Substack and have been in touch with to just like hear about their experiences and what's working and what's not working. And I think that I see a future, not just with local news, but in general. One of the things that we talk a lot about, and you probably all are familiar with this inside the Substack ecosystem, but right now the sort of bread and butter, the main thing that Substack is known for is having the main writer that you subscribe to and trust and value, and that's the main relationship. But there are sort of small media companies on Substack, and those media companies typically have the few that sort of we've seen on Substack. What we're experimenting and piloting with is the ability to have multiple newsletters and multiple podcasts under one umbrella, so that you can subscribe as a reader. You can sort of pick and choose which editorial products you want to subscribe to. And I think as we sort of like make that more available, we've sort of been piloting it for a while, working with a few publishers on it. But as we make that more widely available, and I think about the local news and what's possible there, the local news landscape, I think that could be a really interesting tool for people, and potentially would make it more interesting for teams of writers to come onto Substack and sort of start covering like their local news category more prominently and more full time. But yeah, I hope so.
That's awesome. I want to shift us back, Fiona, to earlier in the conversation and sort of your experience as an employee. I know Varun had a question very early on. Is Substack only a year old, or how sort of old?
Yeah.
It's employee.
Yeah, it's a little over the, 3 years old, I think. So it was the 3 founders for about 2 years, just doing their thing. And then, and now we're at year 3 and we're about 20 people. So we're still very much startup, scrappy, trying to do a million things at once, but also really focusing on growing our team. So if anyone is interested, would love to talk about having you kind of come and talk about your interest in working at Substack. We have roles literally across the entire team and are hiring many more. So
that's amazing. And I know folks are pretty excited. Jeremy asked earlier, like, can you tell us just about like your day to day and like what's a day in the life of you at Substack, and what % of time are you talking to individual creators versus publications versus internal meetings and otherwise, and what do you find the most rewarding or not rewarding, and tell us a little bit about like a day in the life of you and your team.
Wow. Okay. That's a great question. I'm just sort of like, oh my gosh, there's so many things going on that I will say a lot of things probably. So what I spend the most time on is talking to writers. So that is the majority of my job. And that looks like it's twofold. So it's reaching out to writers that aren't on Substack today that might be a really good fit for the model and talking with them about what that looks like. And then talking with writers already publishing on Substack about strategies and ways to kind of succeed. And so to dig in on that, like what that might actually look like in a day-to-day is, maybe a writer has been publishing on Substack for a couple of months and they're interested in turning on paid subscriptions, and they are really looking for like, what is the particular strategy that they might employ for the publication that they are at the helm of? How should they launch? What should it be priced at? Is there sort of a discounted rate, and how long should that discount run? All of those types of questions. So I work really closely with writers. That's the main thing that I do, but I spend a lot of time on beyond that part, figuring out how to grow the team. So we're hiring, and I'm spending a lot of time figuring out sort of just like team structure. So right now, this is maybe too in the weeds, but there's a group of people at Substack that we sort of like informally call the writer team, because it's the team of people that work with writers. And I'm on the partnerships side of the house. And then there's a team that's called the writer experience team. And that's the team that's that works with writers, but thinks about it in a completely different way than partnerships. Writer experience is more like our content, our podcast, our blog, our case studies, our resources. How do we scale all of the educational things, all of the insights that I might give to a writer one-on-one? How do I take what I've just said and what I'm learning through the experience of working with writers and get that into a case study that we can share broadly with everyone, so that there's a knowledge base of all of these examples, everything that we're learning from other writers. So there's somebody who focuses on that. And then we have somebody who focuses on our community. And what that means is running fellowship programs, mentorship programs is in place right now. She's going to be running our workshops, so bringing writers together to kind of meet each other. She hosts a fairly frequently sort of like silent writing hour where it just come on, hang out with other writers and write. So I'm sort of thinking about how do we build all of those muscles, and how do we hire people that would be a fit for the writer team, basically.
That's awesome. And so we talked a little bit about just RenCo sort of being a community of smart generalists. And are there things that you think, would make smart generalists a particularly good fit for some of the roles that, you're looking to fill at Substack? Like what do you think a smart generalist could bring to your team?
I mean, a smart generalist is like the absolute dream for Substack, to be honest, which is why I was so thrilled. And I feel so lucky to be able to talk to this group, in part because, and this is true probably of other startups, but I feel it so much at Substack, which is we're building everything from scratch, right? Like this hasn't been done before and we are figuring it out. So any person who comes to Substack to work is going to be sort of building something from scratch. And so I think a skill set that is required is somebody who kind of has like a broad scope and an interest in learning about a whole bunch of different things at once, and is willing to wear a bunch of different hats. So even though a role might be, the one role we're hiring for it's called special publications. It's working largely with our top publishers. Our top publishers today are going to look really, really different in 6 months, in a year from now. We're evolving so quickly. So it's somebody who would evolve with the company and be sort of open to like the nimble way of like working. So I think the other thing that's true of somebody just coming to work at Substack is, of course, like a really deep passion and interest in what it looks like to change the business model for writing, and wanting to think about that every day. Like, how can we do a better job? How can we sort of make this accessible to people all over the world. Right now, it's really, it's US focused. We haven't even been able to do much internationally. There's just so much growth that we're sort of like headed for, and somebody who would be excited to think about all of those things every day with us.
That's amazing. I think Jen in the chat said it perfectly. She said, "This sounds like fun." It sounds perfect. I think I'm going to sneak in a couple of questions because I know we're coming up in the hour, and then we'll wrap up. But there were a few questions around sort of day in the life and what is it like, sort of picturing you being pitched by writers all the time, and how do you sort of handle those interactions? And Leon had a great question around, what makes someone interesting as a writer from your point of view, and as you're reaching out to others, how do you sort of prioritize that?
Yeah. Well, so two things come to mind. One is that like anyone can get started on Substack, right? So there's no barrier to entry, there's no gatekeepers at all. And that's the whole promise, is that you can kind of just get started and start writing. But in terms of like, who do I reach out to? I think about some of the areas that haven't actually been proven out yet on Substack. So one thing that people seem to know Substack for is like prominent journalists, let's say. And in the early days when I was starting out working at Substack and I was trying to get people on the phone to come over to Substack, one of the tools that I used was sort of like to live on Twitter and find sort of like prolific, opinionated journalists on Twitter who might want to take what they're tweeting about and have it actually be long form and take some of their writing and put it into a subscription. And I spent a lot less time on that, basically no time on that, to be honest, in part because it sort of feels like that is happening. Like journalists seem to know about Substack, and many are coming to Substack. So what I'm more interested in right at this moment is thinking about other forms, other formats, multimedia, audio, what's possible with the model that's beyond that. And so my team, we're working with a lot of illustrators, artists, musicians. We're working with people who are putting out things multimedia with videos. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're sort of thinking about to that's maybe less visible, less proven, and focusing on that area.
That sounds so exciting. Fiona, I wanted to end it with sort of a tradition that I believe DK started, that's sort of our final question to you as we wrap up here heading into the hour. But the way that we have ended sessions, and I believe it started with Highlighter, not RenCo, which is DK's company, but we always end by asking our guests, like, what is something that's top of mind for you that you want to ask us as a community that we can help with? And we want to sort of turn it around and give you the floor to ask us anything.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. What a cool tradition. That's awesome. I sort of spoke about this earlier about the hiring front, and I totally have talked to Nadia about this already, but I would love if any of you know people that would be a fit for the roles that we're hiring for, or not even the ones that are like on our job page, just in general, that would be a fit to like, who are inspired by the model, who are interested in it, even just to have a conversation. I think one of the things in particular that we're looking for on the team is people who have that passion for writing, like I was talking before, have the passion for the business model, but also kind of would feel comfortable in the startup environment. And that's a particular thing. It's we're really small. And we're not going to be small forever, but right now it's like we're all doing a lot of things. And so somebody who would absolutely value that experience of being able to kind of build from scratch. If you yourselves are interested, or if you know anyone, I would love any introductions. That would be a huge help for me.
That's awesome. I think if there's one superpower in RenCo, it's like connecting people and sort of having that like social sticky magic glue. So I have no doubt that we will be following up with some awesome suggestions. What is the best way? I'll follow up with you offline on like what's the best way for us to reach out to you with that, and we can sort of collect.
Email me. But yeah, if you want to give everyone my email address, I would love to hear from all of you. And also, it sounds like there's so many writers in the room. So if you want to just get on the phone and talk about your publication, truly, like that's what I do all day. And I don't know if I can answer everything, but I can try to do my best to help and strategize with you. I would love that.
That's so amazing. Thank you so much, Fiona. We've been so excited to have you here and just listen to your experiences and thoughts and insights. You have been so amazing, and thank you for taking the time to be our guest. And I have no doubt that you're going to be getting a lot of emails from this community. RenCo and everyone that's here, thank you so much for watching, for bringing the energy on this Wednesday night, for asking such great questions. It's been so great to have you. My final ask is please remember to fill out the survey that Jen will send out afterwards. We super value your feedback on these events, and we'll take it into account as we plan our operators you should know rota for next year. But yeah, big thank you, Fiona. This was absolutely awesome. The chat is blowing up right now with enthusiasm. So thank you so much. It was so good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. What a special community. I'm so glad and honored that you asked.
We feel super lucky. And with that, everyone have a great rest of your Wednesday night. I feel like there's so much energy that I'm gonna have a hard time sleeping after this, but this was absolutely awesome. Have such a good night and rest of your week. And thank you again, Fiona and everyone.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.